The walls of Tyre stretched across the Mediterranean like a granite finger pointing toward eternity. For 7 months, the most impregnable fortress in the ancient world had laughed at the armies below. Ships from across the known world sailed safely into its harbors, while siege engines shattered uselessly against stone that had stood for centuries. The defenders had every reason to be confident. After all, no one had ever taken Tyre by force. No one, that is, until a 24-year-old king arrived with an idea so audacious, so impossible, that it would rewrite the very rules of warfare forever. This is the story of how Alexander the Great didn't just conquer cities, he obliterated the concept of the unconquerable. His siege warfare wasn't merely about battering rams and catapults. It was about reimagining what was possible when human ambition collided with engineering genius and absolute ruthlessness. By the time Alexander was finished reshaping the ancient world, fortresses that had stood for millennia lay in ruins, and the very notion of an impregnable stronghold had become a relic of the past. The summer of 334 BCE marked more than just another military campaign. It was the beginning of a revolution in siegecraft that would echo through history. While other generals saw walls as obstacles, Alexander saw them as puzzles to be solved through innovation, deception, and sheer audacity. His methods were so groundbreaking that they stunned not only his enemies, but his own allies. Cities surrendered at the mere mention of his name, and those that resisted discovered that their ancient defenses were no match for a mind that refused to accept the impossible. What made Alexander's approach so devastating wasn't just his tactical brilliance. It was his willingness to combine cutting-edge engineering with psychological warfare, turning every siege into a masterclass in both destruction and terror. He understood something, the strongest, that his predecessors had missed. Wars in the world meant nothing if you could convince an entire population that resistance was futile. And when persuasion failed, he possessed the tools and the vision to make the impossible happen. The ancient world had never seen anything like what Alexander brought to the art of siege warfare. Traditional besieging forces would surround a city, cut off supplies, and wait for starvation to do the work. Months would pass, sometimes years, as armies camped outside walls, hoping that hunger would succeed where weapons had failed. But Alexander had no patience for such methods. Time was his enemy, and every day spent outside a city's walls was a day that rebellions could brew in his rear or rival powers could organize against him. Instead of waiting for cities to surrender, Alexander brought revolution to their gates. His engineers didn't just build siege engines, they built marvels of mechanical ingenuity that transformed warfare itself. Towers that soared higher than the walls they attacked, catapults that hurled stones the size of wine barrels, and battering rams powered by mechanisms so sophisticated that they seemed like magic to those who witnessed them in action. But the true genius of Alexander's siegecraft lay not in any single innovation, but in how he orchestrated multiple tactics into a symphony of destruction. While his engineers prepared their mechanical marvels, his spies worked within the enemy walls, spreading doubt and fear. His diplomats offered terms that seemed generous until the alternative became clear. And his soldiers demonstrated a level of discipline and coordination that turned every assault into a precisely choreographed dance of death. The siege of Halicarnassus had been a preview of what was to come. When the city's defenders thought they could outlast the young Macedonian king, they discovered that Alexander's engineers had developed techniques for undermining walls that left ancient fortifications crumbling into dust. The defenders watched in horror as sections of their supposedly impregnable defenses simply collapsed, revealing gaps that Alexander's phalanx exploited with devastating efficiency. Yet Halicarnassus was merely the opening act. The real demonstration of Alexander's revolutionary approach to siege warfare would come at Tyre, where an island fortress that had never fallen to a land-based army would face an opponent who refused to acknowledge the limitations that had protected it for centuries. The Tyrians had grown comfortable in their island stronghold, protected by treacherous waters and walls that rose directly from the sea. They had wealth, they had allies, and they had the confidence that came from never having been conquered. Alexander arrived at the shores opposite Tyre in 332 BCE with something the city had never faced before. Not just an army, but a vision that transcended conventional thinking about what was possible in warfare. While his generals looked at the half-mile of water separating them from the island fortress, and saw an insurmountable obstacle, Alexander saw an opportunity to demonstrate that there were no limits to what human ingenuity could accomplish when backed by absolute determination. The king's solution was breathtaking in its audacity. If he couldn't sail to Tyre, he would walk there. Alexander ordered the construction of a causeway, a massive stone and timber bridge that would stretch across the water to connect the mainland with the island fortress. His engineers set to work with materials gathered from the ruins of old Tyre, the abandoned settlement on the shore, and from quarries stretching across the region. Day by day, the causeway grew. Stone by stone, timber by timber, Alexander's bridge crept across the water toward the island that had never been taken by force. The Tyrians watched from their walls with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread as the impossible became inevitable. This wasn't just engineering. It was a declaration that Alexander recognized no natural barriers, no divine protection, no historical precedent that could stand against his will. But the causeway was only the beginning. As his bridge neared completion, Alexander revealed the full scope of his revolutionary approach to siege warfare. The causeway wasn't just a means of reaching Tyre's walls. It was a platform for siege engines, unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Towers that rose higher than the city's defenses, catapults capable of hurling projectiles with precision and power that made traditional siege weapons look like children's toys, and battering rams designed specifically to breach walls that had been considered unbreachable. The psychological impact of Alexander's methods was as devastating as the physical destruction they caused. Defenders who had grown up believing their walls were blessed by the gods watched those same walls crumble under the assault of machines that seemed to possess supernatural power. The very sight of Alexander's siege engines approaching was enough to break the morale of garrisons that had never known defeat. What truly set Alexander apart from every general who had come before him was his understanding that siege warfare wasn't just about breaking down walls. It was about breaking down the will to resist. Every innovation his engineers developed, every impossible feat they accomplished, sent a message that resonated far beyond the immediate battlefield. Cities throughout the region began to understand that the old rules no longer applied, that the protection they had relied upon for generations could be swept away by a king who refused to accept that anything was impossible. The transformation Alexander brought to siege warfare would reshape not only his own campaigns, but the entire future of military strategy. His methods would be studied, copied, and refined by generals for centuries to come, but none would match the devastating combination of innovation, psychology, and sheer audacious vision that made Alexander's siegecraft a force that could bring down civilizations. The defenders of Tyre unleashed every weapon in their arsenal against Alexander's growing causeway. Fireships sailed out under cover of darkness, their hulls packed with pitch and sulfur, attempting to burn the wooden sections of the bridge. Divers slipped beneath the waves to soar through the underwater supports, while archers on the walls sent volleys of arrows into the workers laboring to extend the stone pathway. Yet for every section they damaged, Alexander's engineers rebuilt it stronger. For every attack they mounted, the Macedonian king had already prepared a counter-strategy. Alexander's response to Tyrian resistance revealed another dimension of his siege warfare genius. He didn't simply react to enemy tactics. He anticipated them, planned for them, and turned them into opportunities to demonstrate his superiority. When the Tyrians sent fireships against his causeway, Alexander had his engineers waiting with chains and grappling hooks to capture the vessels and use their materials to strengthen his own defenses. When enemy divers attacked his underwater supports, he had already positioned nets and guards to catch them in the act. The siege towers that Alexander's engineers constructed for the assault on Tyre were marvels that defied contemporary understanding of what was possible. These weren't the simple wooden structures that other armies used to overtop enemy walls. These were engineering masterpieces, mobile fortresses that combined height with stability, protection with offensive capability. Each tower was a self-contained weapon system, equipped with catapults on multiple levels, drawbridges that could extend across gaps, and armor plating that could withstand the heaviest stones the defenders could hurl. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Alexander's siege towers was their mobility. Previous siege engines had been static affairs, built in place and vulnerable to enemy fire. Alexander's towers could be moved, repositioned, and coordinated like pieces on a game board. His engineers developed wheel systems and counterweight mechanisms that allowed these massive structures to advance and retreat with precision, always staying one step ahead of the defenders' attempts to destroy them. The Tyrians had never faced siege engines that could adapt to their defensive measures. When they concentrated their fire on one tower, Alexander would shift his assault to another section of the wall. When they tried to undermine the foundations of his machines, they discovered that his engineers had already reinforced the ground with techniques borrowed from military architecture across his empire. Every innovation the defenders attempted was met with a counter-innovation that demonstrated the futility of resistance. Alexander's use of naval power in the siege of Tyre revealed yet another layer of his tactical genius. While his causeway provided the primary means of assault, he simultaneously assembled a fleet that could attack the island from all directions. Ships from Cyprus, Phoenicia, and Rhodes joined his armada, creating a naval force that could blockade Tyre's harbors while providing platforms for additional siege engines. The city found itself under assault not just from the causeway, but from every direction that water touched its shores. The coordination between Alexander's land and sea forces during the Tyre siege became a template for combined operations that would influence military strategy for generations. His engineers developed floating siege towers that could be positioned alongside the island's walls, while his naval commanders perfected techniques for amphibious assault that turned every section of Tyre's coastline into a potential breach point. The defenders couldn't concentrate their forces on any single threat because Alexander had created multiple simultaneous dangers. As the siege progressed, Alexander introduced psychological warfare tactics that were as devastating as his engineering innovations. He made sure that messengers from Tyre could see the full scope of his preparations, the endless resources being brought to bear against their city. Prisoners taken in skirmishes were treated well and released to carry word back to the defenders about the futility of continued resistance. Every aspect of Alexander's siege was designed not just to break down walls, but to break down hope. The final assault on Tyre demonstrated the full revolutionary potential of Alexander's siege warfare methods. His causeway had reached the island, his towers were in position, and his naval forces controlled the waters around the city. But rather than launching a single massive attack, Alexander orchestrated a series of coordinated strikes that overwhelmed the defenders' ability to respond. Siege engines pounded different sections of the wall simultaneously, while Marines landed on the harbor side and assault troops advanced across the causeway. The fall of Tyre sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world that went far beyond the immediate military victory. For the first time in history, an island fortress that had been considered absolutely impregnable had been taken by force. The impossible had become inevitable, and every fortified city from Egypt to India suddenly understood that their walls might not be enough to stop Alexander the Great. The psychological impact of Tyre's fall was perhaps more valuable to Alexander than the city itself. News of the siege's success traveled faster than Alexander's army, carried by merchants, diplomats, and refugees who spread tales of the young king's incredible engineering feats. Cities that might have resisted began sending envoys to negotiate surrender terms before Alexander's forces even appeared on their horizons. The reputation of his siegecraft became a weapon in its own right, one that could conquer territories without a single arrow being fired. Yet Alexander was far from finished revolutionizing the art of siege warfare. The techniques perfected at Tyre would be refined and enhanced as his campaigns continued eastward. Each new fortress that challenged him became the boundaries of what was possible, even an opportunity to push further. The mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed countless armies march through their passes, but none had brought the mechanical marvels that now crawled across the rocky terrain like metal beasts. Alexander's siege train had evolved since Tyre, transformed by lessons learned from every fortress that had dared to challenge him. The wheeled towers now stood taller than temple spires, their bronze-reinforced frames capable of withstanding impacts that would have shattered their predecessors. Each engine was a masterpiece of engineering, combining the mathematical precision of Greek geometry with the raw power needed to breach walls of mountain strongholds that had stood for centuries. The siege of the Sogdian rock demonstrated how completely Alexander had revolutionized the relationship between attacker and defender. This fortress, perched on a cliff face that rose sheer from the valley floor, had never been approached by siege engines. Its defenders believed that the gods themselves had carved their stronghold to be unconquerable. Yet, Alexander's engineers surveyed the impossible terrain and began sketching designs for equipment that could scale vertical stone faces. They developed pulley systems that could lift catapults up cliff walls and constructed platforms that could be anchored to rock faces to provide stable firing positions. What emerged from these innovations was a new form of warfare that treated gravity itself as just another obstacle to overcome. Alexander's siege specialists created techniques for vertical assault that turned sheer cliffs into highways for their mechanical marvels. Towers designed specifically for mountain warfare could be dismantled, carried piece by piece up treacherous paths, and reassembled on narrow ledges that previous generals would never have considered as positions for siege engines. The defenders watched in stunned disbelief as catapults appeared on seemingly inaccessible peaks, raining stones down from angles they had never imagined possible. The psychological warfare that accompanied these engineering feats was equally revolutionary. Alexander understood that the sight of his impossible machines appearing in impossible places did more damage to enemy morale than the actual stones they hurled. Defenders who had spent their lives believing in the natural protection of their fortress walls suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. When siege engines could climb vertical cliffs, when towers could be built higher than mountains, when water could be bridged and stone could be moved at will, what defense could possibly stand? Alexander's innovations in siege warfare extended far beyond the mechanical. He pioneered the use of specialized assault troops, trained specifically for fortress warfare, soldiers who could scale walls with equipment designed for vertical combat. His engineers developed grappling systems that could anchor siege towers to enemy fortifications, essentially turning the defenders' own walls into support structures for the attacking force. These techniques required a level of coordination and training that transformed Alexander's army from a collection of warriors into a precision instrument designed specifically for breaking strongholds. The speed with which Alexander could deploy his siege equipment became another revolutionary element of his warfare. While traditional armies required weeks to construct their siege engines after arriving at a fortress, Alexander's forces could have their towers and catapults operational within days. His engineers had perfected modular designs that allowed complex machines to be pre-built in sections, transported rapidly across vast distances, and assembled with speed that left enemy commanders scrambling to respond. By the time defenders had fully assessed the threat, Alexander's engines were already pounding their walls. The siege of Aornos rock in India showcased the full maturity of Alexander's siegecraft innovations. This mountain fortress, sacred to the local population and considered blessed with divine protection, had repelled every previous attempt at conquest. Its walls rose from precipices that seemed to touch the clouds, and its defenders possessed generations of experience in mountain warfare. Yet Alexander arrived with siege techniques that had been refined through years of conquering the impossible, and his engineers immediately began adapting their methods to this new challenge. The approach to Aornos demonstrated how Alexander's siege warfare had evolved into something approaching an art form. His engineers didn't simply attack the fortress directly. Instead, they began reshaping the very landscape around it, building ramps and platforms that gradually brought their siege engines to the same level as the mountain stronghold. This wasn't just engineering. It was landscape architecture on a scale that dwarfed the construction projects of entire civilizations. Alexander was literally moving mountains to reach his enemies. The techniques developed for the Aornos siege would influence military engineering for centuries to come. Alexander's engineers created methods for building siege ramps on slopes so steep that previous generals would have declared them impossible to climb, let alone construct upon. They developed anchoring systems that could secure massive siege towers to mountainsides, and invented counterweight mechanisms that allowed their catapults to fire upward at extreme angles without toppling backward from the recoil. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Alexander's mountain siege warfare was how he used the terrain itself as a weapon. His engineers would trigger controlled rock slides to clear defensive positions, redirect mountain streams to undermine enemy foundations, and use the natural acoustics of mountain valleys to amplify the psychological impact of their siege engines. Every natural feature became a tool in Alexander's arsenal, transformed by engineering genius into an instrument of conquest. The defenders of mountain fortresses discovered that their greatest advantages could be turned against them. The very isolation that had protected them from previous armies became a trap when Alexander's siege engines could operate in terrain that no previous force had been able to reach. The height that had given them superior positions for archery became meaningless when Alexander's towers could rise even higher. The narrow approaches that had channeled attacking forces into killing zones were bypassed entirely by engineering techniques that treated vertical cliff faces as viable routes of advance. Alexander's siege warfare innovations weren't limited to the grand spectacles of his most famous conquests. He developed rapid assault techniques for smaller fortifications that could reduce a stronghold to rubble in a matter of hours rather than days. His engineers created portable siege equipment that could be carried by individual soldiers, allowing every member of his army to contribute to fortress-breaking operations. These innovations meant that even minor defensive positions could be overwhelmed with speed that left their garrisons no time to call for reinforcement. The standardization of siege techniques across Alexander's entire army was another revolutionary development that his predecessors had never achieved. Every unit knew how to construct basic siege engines, every officer understood the principles of fortress assault, and every soldier had been trained in the specialized skills needed for wall-scaling operations. This distributed expertise meant that Alexander could conduct multiple siege operations simultaneously, dividing his forces without losing the concentrated engineering capability that made his fortress breaking possible. The impact of Alexander's siege warfare extended far beyond the immediate military advantages it provided. Cities throughout his expanding empire began redesigning their defenses based on the new realities his innovations had created. Traditional walls became obsolete overnight, replaced by more complex fortification systems designed to counter the specific techniques Alexander had perfected. The arms race between siegecraft and defensive architecture that would dominate military thinking for centuries had begun with Alexander's revolutionary approaches to fortress warfare. Yet even as cities adapted their defenses to counter his methods, Alexander's engineers continued to innovate. They developed siege techniques that could adapt to new forms of fortification, creating a cycle of military evolution that kept Alexander's forces perpetually ahead of their enemies. Every new defensive innovation sparked a corresponding advancement in siegecraft, ensuring that no fortress could remain safe simply by copying the defensive methods that had failed elsewhere. The legacy of Alexander's siege warfare innovations would outlive his empire by centuries. Roman engineers would study his techniques and build upon them to create siege engines that could breach the walls of entire civilizations. Medieval castle builders would design their fortifications specifically to counter methods that Alexander had pioneered over 1,000 years earlier. The fundamental principles he established would echo through military history, influencing warfare long after his name had become legend. But in the moment, as Alexander's siege engines rolled across the landscapes of the ancient world, they represented something more immediate and terrifying. They were the tools of a mind that refused to acknowledge limitations, wielded by an army that had been trained to make the impossible seem inevitable. Every fortress that fell to Alexander's innovations sent a message that would reshape the ancient world's understanding of power itself. The psychological revolution Alexander unleashed was as devastating as his mechanical innovations. Word of his impossible victories spread like wildfire through trade routes and diplomatic channels, carried by merchants who had witnessed mountains moved and waters bridged. In the courts of distant kingdoms, advisors whispered fearfully about a young king whose engineers could make stone flow like water, and whose siege towers could climb to the heavens themselves. The very mention of his name began to crack the foundations of fortresses before his armies even appeared on the horizon. This terror was precisely what Alexander had calculated. His siege warfare wasn't just about conquering individual cities. It was about creating a reputation so overwhelming that resistance itself seemed futile. Each impossible feat his engineers accomplished was designed to echo across continents, reaching the ears of kings and generals who had never seen a Macedonian soldier. The siege of a single mountain fortress in Afghanistan would send tremors of fear through palace walls in India, Egypt, and beyond. The speed of Alexander's conquests accelerated as his reputation preceded him. Cities that might have withstood months of traditional siege warfare now opened their gates after mere days of negotiation. Governors who had spent fortunes strengthening their walls discovered that their investments meant nothing against an enemy who could reshape the very landscape around their strongholds. The mathematics of resistance had fundamentally changed, and Alexander held all the variables. Yet the true genius of his approach lay in how he transformed each conquest into preparation for the next. Every fortress that fell became a laboratory where his engineers could test new techniques and refine existing ones. The siege equipment captured from defeated enemies was studied, improved, and incorporated into designs that made his next assault even more devastating. Alexander's army became a learning machine, constantly evolving its methods based on the challenges each new conquest presented. When the dust settled and the last fortress fell, Alexander had accomplished something that went far beyond military conquest. He had shattered the ancient world's understanding of what was possible, transforming siege warfare from a patient war of attrition into a spectacular demonstration of human ingenuity unleashed. His legacy lived on in every castle wall redesigned to counter his methods, every siege engine built on his principles, and every general who dared to dream that the impossible could become inevitable through vision, determination, and the courage to defy the limitations that others accepted as absolute truth.